Hey everybody. If you really love Alla Prima oil painting, chances are brushwork is something that is really important to you. But we can't really talk about brushwork without talking about brushes. So today I wanted to walk you through all of the different types of brushes that I like to use and give you a quick explanation of what I actually use them for, and also give you a quick guide on how you can use these for yourself. So if you want to better understand how to create expressive brushwork in your oil paintings, or if you have a lot of different types of brushes with which to paint, but you just don't know what brush to grab when, make sure you watch through this entire video because I'm going to be walking you through all of the different brushes that I use, including different shapes, different styles, different materials, and how each of these can be used in different circumstances, specifically for expressive loose oil painting. And by the way, if this style of loose oil painting is something that really resonates with you, if it's something you want to learn more about and you want to get better at putting this to work in your own artwork, this is what I specialize in teaching, and there's a link below to reach out to me to actually have a one-on-one chat with me to see if working together would be a fit for both of us. All right, let's go ahead and dive in with these brushes. And I want to start with a brush that is probably one of the most common. Now, this is a Rosemary brush, but you might have seen really similar brushes from a number of different brands. This is probably one of the most common bristle types that I see. So just to give you a quick peek, here is what this looks like in an equivalent silver brush. So I have the silver on the left, and then I have a slightly different Rosemary. This is a Bravura filbert on the right. And when I actually have all of these together, especially if all of these were new, you might notice that they have a pretty similar appearance. This one is a little bit darker. I think that is actually just because of the use that this brush has gotten. But what's most notable to me is that all of these brushes have a very similar spring in the bristles. This one has a little bit of oil in it right now, so it's not behaving quite the way it typically would if it were perfectly clean. But the spring between the bristles that I have here and here are pretty similar. So the reason that I really tend to use a brush like this, and I think the reason why most people will pick up one of these brushes, they tend to hold their shape pretty darn well, and you can really kind of like bend these brushes to your will almost. You can make them actually carry a lot of paint. A lot of painters will pick up a bristle brush like this, regardless of the shape, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a filbert like these. It could be a short flat, also known as a bright. It can be a long flat. It can even be like a pointed round brush. The shape really isn't what's most important here. It's really the bristle type that is, I think, its defining characteristic. I find that painters often will pick up these brushes specifically because they can really be bent to your will, as I was saying before. And this often takes the form of painters wanting to use these brushes to get away with actually using a lot less paint than they actually should be using to get the desired effects. So in the painting behind me, for instance, I actually have some notable areas of impasto on this piece. So you can see I have this mark up here, this kind of king's blue colored mark down below. Both of these marks have a decent amount of thickness to them. Now, what's noteworthy about these marks is that typically painters will actually try to get some of this painterly quality through just really pressing that brush down onto a surface, even when there just isn't enough paint on that brush. That's actually much more likely to get you marks like the ones that we see that have more of this like dry brush effect, where there's a lot of this canvas texture showing through. Really, the secret to getting these like very juicy, more thicker impasto marks really doesn't come from the brush itself. It comes from having enough paint on your brush and actually depositing that paint very gently onto the surface rather than trying to like press it down. Pressing the brush down really heavily, especially when you don't have enough paint, will actually really flatten out your impasto rather than allowing that impasto to build. So you might be wondering, all right, well, if I naturally would want to grab for a brush like this because of its ability to build impasto, but this brush isn't necessarily ideal for that. Counterintuitively, it can actually really encourage the opposite habits that we need for this. What are these brushes used for? And the truth is, I actually like these kinds of brushes for really two main purposes. One, I find they're really great for getting some of the abstract brushwork that we get in really early stages of the painting when maybe it's thinned with solvent versus being thinned with medium. So anywhere where you see paint that has actually been thinned out to the point of translucency, especially paint that goes down early, I actually tend to really prefer to apply that with something like a bristle brush or a synthetic bristle like you see with this Rosemary brush. The other situation where you will see me use this brush would be actually any situation where I really want to take advantage of the fact that this brush has such a clean, crisp shape to it. So anywhere that I want a really clean edge, or I just want to feel a lot of control of where the paint is being deposited, a brush like this is actually pretty darn ideal. So I actually painted a lot of her face and the details of her skin tones with this brush. Now, I will often choose this brush at smaller sizes like this size 4 for those kinds of details. And then I will choose this brush in a larger size, oftentimes for the translucent brushwork that goes in at the beginning of the painting and looks really abstract. The reason that this brush works so well for both is that I find that the spring that these bristles offer really lets some interesting mark making come through. So for instance, if you see this little swoop of paint here, this really wouldn't have happened with a brush that was super soft. You need a little bit of that resistance or that kind of character from the brush's stiffness to make some of those more interesting marks. Now, one brush that I want to talk about that is pretty similar, this is a Rosemary Evergreen filbert. And so I have the evergreens in a few different shapes. I have them in short and long flats as well as filberts, and I have them in a wide variety of sizes. This is a brush that's pretty specific to Rosemary, and what makes it noteworthy, and the reason why I'm including it in this video, well, one, I'm including all of the brushes that I use in this video, but the reason that I have this in particular is that it actually is the same bristle as this Ivory, but the bristles have been dyed, and in having them be dyed, they are actually a little bit softer than the standard Ivory bristle. But what I like about these is they really maintain that crisp, clean shape just as well as the Ivories do. I find that they're sometimes a little soft for that very beginning brushwork, but I really like them for detail work and blending. I will often use these evergreens in a slightly smaller size because Oftentimes when I really want the blending, I also want a little bit of a smaller, more refined shape. So lately, these two brush types have really gotten me through the vast majority of all of the paintings that I've been making. Now, third place here comes to a Creative Mark Qualita brush. This actually has a very similar feel in performance to the Rosemary Evergreen. You'll see in this particular brush, I have this in a short flat, but I have this in a variety of shapes. So I have some filberts and I have some long flats, as well as this short flat. So if I put these side by side, one thing to note is that the Creative Mark, it is a little bit, I would say, thinner, and as a result, I just find that I can control the shape a little bit better. The Rosemary, even though these aren't the same size, the Rosemary tends to be packed quite a bit thicker. But overall, the softness and the performance of the bristles, both of these are synthetic brushes. They tend to just perform very, very similarly. So especially for something like this short flat, this bright, for the Creative Mark, I find that it's really good at depositing very uniform shapes of color, especially if the paint is reasonably thinned. I can almost get an effect that feels closer to watercolor. So I tend to use these Creative Mark brushes a little bit earlier in the process, usually when I'm doing things like massing in my shadow shapes, because those shadow shapes tend to be a little bit on the thinner side. I'm usually using Gamsol to thin out those shapes. And typically using a brush like this allows the transparency of those dark shapes to go down really, really evenly. And the really crisp edges of this synthetic brush allow me to control the edges of that darker block in very cleanly. I get a lot of control in the drawing stages thanks to brushes like this. Now, I would say this brush is actually pretty similar to a Sable as well. So I do have a few different Sable brushes. I do not use them very often. What I have here is a Rosemary Red Dot comber. This has a very soft feel. The tip has been serrated just a little bit. I think it's hard to see this on camera, but you might be able to notice that the Creative Mark has this like very even blunted top where it's a little bit like more jagged in the Rosemary brush. That is because it is a comber and that shape is by design, so it doesn't create quite as even of a mark. But just based on the kind of softer, more pliable character of these brushes, again, I find they're really nice for when the paint is quite thin and I want a very even, predictable mark, even despite the fact that this is a comber. Now, this actually brings me to a different brush that I have in my arsenal here. This is a Rosemary Eclipse Extra Long Comber. You might notice this has like a similar serrated tip. It's difficult to see on camera unless I put it against the white background. But when I do have it against that white background, you should be able to see that there are little places where the light color of the painting in the background is coming through. This brush, I would say, it has a slightly different texture than the Sable. I'm not honestly really sure how I would describe it. It's almost like floppier while still being very soft, similar to the Sable. So this brush is really, really tricky. Whenever I have students of mine test out this brush, or I see subscribers test out this brush for the first time, inevitably I typically hear a story about just how frustrating this brush is. And the reason is that this brush is so soft that you simply cannot expect to essentially boss it around the way you can boss around something like this Ivory filbert or any other bristle brush. The bristles are so long that they will very easily like splay and make shapes that you do not expect. And if you do not have enough paint on your brush, or if you don't have enough medium in that paint for easy flow, it can feel like there's no way to actually successfully get your paint off the brush and onto the canvas. But what this can actually be useful for is it can really help to break you of bad habits. So if you've been using a really stiff bristle brush for a long time and you're in a habit of using too little paint, switching to something like this Eclipse can actually really force you to start using enough paint. So one thing that I think is really noteworthy about this brush and the mark that it makes a very almost like sawtooth style mark. If you're really familiar with paintings by Daniel Keyes, for instance, a lot of the brushwork and his florals especially have this kind of serrated quality to the mark. It's really perfect for his style, and if you really like those kinds of brush marks, I think a brush like this can be fantastic. It is certainly not the only use for these brushes though. I do have friends who don't work Alla Prima, who really like these Eclipse combers for completely different uses than I do. But for me, they've been really useful in kind of forcing me to let go of the more tight, controlled marks that I would get from something like an Ivory or a general bristle brush, and allow the painting to really come forth without actually getting overly tight. And it was also very useful for encouraging me to actually start building up more impasto and using more paint. That being said, I haven't really been using these Eclipse combers lately in my paintings. So anything you've seen me make on YouTube in the past year or so, the combers were probably used at a minimum. In fact, I would say for the past year, the overwhelming majority of the brushes I've used have been probably one of these three brushes all the way through. So just to recap, these brushes are a synthetic bristle, a slightly softer synthetic bristle, and then a slightly softer synthetic than that. That is what I've been using for probably 99% of the time that I have brush touching canvas. And that's been true for, I'd say, the past year or two worth of paintings. And if you're ever curious about a specific painting or YouTube video, I would encourage you to simply pause that video in the section that I'm working on and actually just see, what does the brush tip look like? What color is it? Thankfully, the brushes I use can be very easily identified by the color of the bristle and then the color of the handle. So speaking of something like the Eclipse comber, something that has more of a natural feeling and definitely a softer texture, and one that's a little bit harder to control, I want to talk about the Rosemary Master's Choice brushes. So this is what I have here. This is the slightly older version of the Master's Choice. And then this is the slightly newer one. And both of these are a synthetic mongoose alternative. What to me is noteworthy about these, I would say they have like a little bit more spring than something like the Eclipse comber, but they have a very natural shape. So as soon as I start using these tend to lose the really crisp edge that you can actually see in both of these brushes. And especially if I compare it to something like this Ivory, this synthetic bristle brush, you should be able to see that it's actually a bit more soft, and that the bristles create a slightly less like clean, uniform, crisp shape. So I haven't been using these Master's Choice nearly as much recently. I think that for me, their utility is pretty similar to something like the Eclipse comber, but they create a little bit less of that like sawtooth pattern. They can really be helpful in allowing you to let go of really closely controlling all of the shapes that you put down, and instead they can let you embrace a more naturalistic, almost like wild mark. If you've been wanting to create something that is less tight and less controlled, I would say that any of these three options can be really helpful in that journey, but it might come with a bit of a steep learning curve because these brushes are simply a little bit harder to control. In my journey with each of these, what I found was really helpful was to stop trying to control the outcome of what the brushes produced and instead just be open to the mark that the brush wanted to make. And as an extension of that, to make sure that I experimented with using more paint and getting more paint on the brush, and additionally, making sure that paint was adequately thinned with medium, that it had a movable consistency. So to give you a little bit of a visual of what that really means, I don't really like working with paint that is the consistency of something like toothpaste or stiffer out of the tube, or tackier out of the tube. I tend to prefer something that gets closer to almost like a mayonnaise-like consistency. So right off the bat, I think that should be helpful. And then one other thing that I want to show you is just how much paint I actually have on my palette. So let me just give you a quick close-up of the piles of paint that I have here. Notice that these are not stingy little piles. So compare the big piles I have to these teeny tiny piles of cadmium, which I barely use. You can see compared to the size of this size 4 filbert, these piles are pretty darn small and stingy. But if I take this over here and really show you the size of the pile compared to the size of the brush, you can see I have quite a bit of paint out here. So if you are looking to experiment with some of these softer colors, I would highly suggest that you start by putting out more paint and then use the consistencies that I gave you as a little bit of a guide for whether or not you need to be adding medium to that paint. And then last up for today, I have 2 specialty tools / brushes here. So on the left, I actually have a Sable Fan Brush. It's not really important that it's Sable or a Sable alternative. What really matters is that it's soft. And on the right, I have a silicone spatula tool. So the fan brush I really like using for situations where I have glare on the canvas. So I don't actually have any of that happening on this piece here, but if you've ever had a situation, especially if you have areas of really dark paint, and it's typically gonna happen near the top of your canvas, where you just, no matter what angle you're painting from, there's glare on the top of the piece. If you take a clean, dry fan brush like this, and you just very gently pull the brush down the piece, if you choose a soft enough fan brush, and if you make sure that you're cleaning it between strokes, what it will do is it will actually just subtly knock down any horizontal impasto that's catching the light and creating glare. So it can be really useful if you're working on a painting that has started to set up or where the lighting is just a little bit of a challenge. It can really help to knock down that impasto just enough so that you can genuinely see what you're doing. And then finally, let's talk about this silicone spatula tool. So the silicone spatula tool is really used as an eraser in my case. If you are working off of a canvas that is sufficiently non-absorbent, you can actually use this directly on the canvas while you're painting to fully wipe paint away and get back to a clean white canvas. Now, this does require that you do everything in one sitting so the paint hasn't started to actually set up and dry. But I find that it is usually the cleanest, easiest way that sets me up for most success in terms of actually removing brush marks that aren't in the right place. And there we have it, a quick overview of all of the different types of brushes that I like to use in my paintings. So I've actually really moved away from having specific brushes for a specific stage in the painting, but I do have brushes depending on what kinds of marks I want to make and what my objective for that mark happens to look like. Let me know down in the comments if there are specific brushes that you aren't sure when or how to use, or if you have any follow-up questions for this video. But if you found this helpful and if you would like some help loosening up your paintings, I would love to hear from you. So make sure to check out the link down in the description to have that one-on-one chat with me, so we can talk about working together and see if that would be a fit for both of us. All right, until next time, happy painting.